You know that feeling, when something's so good it can't possibly be real? That was Lana, and I didn't see her coming. It started on one of those nights you don't think will change anything. Just another corporate event, another glass of cheap wine in a hotel ballroom. I was halfway through a conversation with some guy from marketing when I noticed her, standing by the door like she owned the room. Dark eyes, sharp features, and this vibe like she knew everyone's secrets. I don't know why, but I couldn't look away. She caught me staring and smiled. This quick, confident flash that hit me harder than I'd like to admit. Before I knew it, I was making my way over, feeling a little out of my league, but too curious to care. "Lana," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, like she was in control. I was hooked before I even knew it. We talked, and it was electric. She was funny, sharp, with this edge that kept me on my toes. Every question she asked felt like it peeled back a layer of me, and I found myself talking more than I should have. Way more than I usually would with someone I just met. And she listened, hanging on every word as if nothing else in that crowded ballroom mattered. She was curious about my work, about this big project I'd been pouring myself into for months. I tried to keep it vague, but her questions slipped past my guard, and before I knew it, I was telling her things I'd never even told my coworkers. It felt easy, natural. The way she looked at me made it impossible to hold back. And then there were the texts. At first, just friendly messages, but soon she'd slip in comments that left me wondering. She'd say things like, "I bet you're one of the few actually keeping that company running," or "When will I get to see your genius work in action?" I laughed it off at first, but she always seemed to know just how to pull me in, making me want to impress her, to prove that I was everything she thought I was. But there was something else. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch myself wondering about her. She was mysterious, didn't give much away about herself. Her job? Consulting, she'd say with a sly smile. Where she lived? Oh, here and there. Every question I threw back her way, she sidestepped with ease, leaving me with more questions than answers. I told myself it didn't matter. I'd always liked a bit of mystery. Then, just as I was getting comfortable with her, things at work started falling apart. It was subtle at first. A missing document here, a delayed email there. But then one morning, I opened my inbox to find a frantic message from my boss. Somehow, a confidential file, my file, had leaked. The project we'd been banking on was now in jeopardy. Worse, it had my name all over it. Me, the guy who'd practically built this thing from scratch, suddenly accused of putting it all at risk. My head was spinning, and no one seemed to believe that I wasn't the one behind it. The only person who didn't ask me a single question? Lana. Instead, she'd text me things like, "I'm sure you'll figure it out, and you're too good to let this stop you." Looking back, I see it so clearly. She knew. Of course, she knew. But back then, I was desperate for an ally, someone who didn't doubt me. And there she was, showing up just when I needed her most. But there was no way I could have guessed the truth, that Lana was working for the enemy, digging for information the entire time. All that charm, the curiosity, the so-called support, it was all a cover. But I only realized this way too late, when I was already in way over my head. I thought she was my escape. But really, she was the one pulling the strings, and I was just her fool, tangled up and clueless. I couldn't get Lana out of my head. Even after that corporate event, her presence lingered. She had this way of making me feel seen, like I was the only guy in the room who mattered. For a few days, I went about my usual routine, thinking I'd just run into her at another event, or that maybe she'd reach out. But then, the message came. "Had a great time talking with you the other night. Coffee soon." It was that simple, and yet it felt like she'd handed me a lifeline. We met up a few days later at this low-key cafe she picked. I hadn't expected her to be so intense. It was like everything I said, every small detail, got her undivided attention. She leaned in close, laughing at my jokes, asking me questions that cut to the core, pulling out stories and thoughts I didn't usually share with anyone. It was a strange mix of exhilarating and unsettling, but I found myself craving it. She seemed fascinated by my job. "So, this project you're working on," she'd say, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What's it like being at the helm of something so important?" I'd laugh, deflecting her questions with vague responses. "Oh, You know, the usual. Long hours, lots of stress, but rewarding when things go right. But Lana had a way of making me want to talk, to explain the details. She'd nod, asking more, prodding gently with questions that sounded innocent, but somehow led me to talk more than I should have. I'd catch myself rambling about some technical aspect or problem we were solving, and I'd see her smile, a little too satisfied, like she'd pulled off a small victory. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing. We were just two people hitting it off. And yeah, maybe I liked the way she looked at me, like I was impressive, like I was someone worth knowing. I wasn't used to that, to feeling seen like that. Then she started sending little gifts. One morning, I found a handwritten note on my car windshield. "You've got this. Can't wait to see what you accomplish." It was signed simply with her name, but there was something personal, even intimate, about the gesture. I felt flattered and excited, like a teenager with a crush. It had been a long time since someone put in that kind of effort for me. The texts got more frequent, too. She'd message me in the middle of the day, asking how things were going, hinting that she couldn't wait to hear more. She knew I couldn't talk specifics, but she kept saying things like, "You must be brilliant to be trusted with something so big. Tell me, how do you stay so calm under pressure?" I didn't realize then that every message, every word was carefully chosen. She wasn't just getting close. She was breaking down every boundary I'd ever had. I told myself it was harmless, that she was just interested in me. But, looking back, I was practically handing her my trust, and she knew exactly what she was doing. After one particularly tough day at work, she suggested dinner. We met at this little place downtown, dimly lit, all cozy corners and intimate spaces. It felt like a date, even if neither of us said it out loud. Over wine, she leaned in close, her hand grazing mine as she listened to me vent about work. At one point, I looked up, and her eyes had this glint, a knowing look, like she understood everything, even the things I wasn't saying. Sometimes I think I get too invested in my work, I admitted, feeling strangely open around her. It's like, if I don't give it everything, I'll lose it. Like someone else could just swoop in and take what I've built. She smiled, a slow, mysterious curve of her lips. "Well, I think that's what makes you different. You know the value of what you're creating, and you're not afraid to protect it." It felt good, hearing her say that. Like she understood my drive, my need to guard what I'd worked so hard for. But there was something in her tone, a subtle edge I couldn't place. The more I saw her, the more her influence on me grew. I found myself thinking about her all the time, replaying our conversations, looking forward to her messages. And she seemed to know exactly when to reach out, when I was stressed, when I'd had a bad day. She'd send a simple text, something encouraging, and somehow, it always made me feel better. I was in deep, and I didn't even know it. At that point, Lana was the person I turned to when things got rough, my confidant, my escape. It felt like we were building something real, something solid. I felt lucky, like I'd stumbled into this incredible connection. But there was one part of her that remained closed off. Whenever I asked about her work, she'd give me vague answers. "Just consulting," she'd say with a shrug, always changing the subject back to me. "Nothing as exciting as what you're doing." And that's what kept me hooked, the mystery. She was interested in every corner of my life, but she held hers close, and I figured it was just her way of keeping things fun, keeping the excitement alive. But there was a part of me that wondered, a small voice that tried to get through, whispering that I was missing something right in front of me. But I didn't listen, because when she looked at me, it was like she was the only person who saw me for who I was. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. It didn't hit me all at once. The feeling crept in slowly, like a draft you only notice after it's too late. Things had been going smoothly with Lana, almost too smoothly. I told myself I was being paranoid. I didn't have any reason to doubt her, but every now and then, a nagging thought would worm its way into my head, and I'd find myself wondering, who exactly was Lana? The questions started as whispers, barely noticeable. Why was she so interested in my work? Why did she always seem to know exactly when I needed support, when I was most stressed? She'd call or text right when something went wrong, as if she had an inside line into my day-to-day. But I shook it off. After all, when you're getting close to someone, it's normal to have doubts. right? Still, I couldn't ignore how distracted I'd become. One night at the office, I was working late, going over some final touches on the project presentation, when my manager called me into his office. His face was pale, almost as if he'd seen a ghost. "Mark, we have a problem," he said, shutting the door. "There's been an information leak." The words hit me like a punch. "A leak? What kind of leak?" He sighed, flipping through a few pages before handing me a printed report. "Some confidential data on our project has somehow made its way outside the company. We're still figuring out how it got out, but if it spreads, we could lose the edge we've been working on for months." My stomach twisted. The report in my hands detailed parts of the project I'd been spearheading, complete with timelines, data analyses, and some of our most guarded strategies. Everything I'd poured myself into was laid out in black and white, like an open wound. I managed a weak nod. "Do we know who's responsible?" He looked at me carefully, his eyes sharp. "No, but it's a serious situation. I need you to keep an eye out, all right? Any small thing could be a lead." I left his office feeling sick. Someone had breached our security, and it wasn't just any project they'd targeted. It was mine, the one I'd practically lived and breathed for the last year. I should have been furious, but my mind kept circling back to one question. Who had the motive to do this? Then, as if in answer, my phone buzzed with a message. It was Lana. "How's work? Hope you're killing it over there." I stared at the screen, feeling a strange chill run down my spine. The timing was too perfect, like she'd known something had gone wrong. She couldn't possibly be involved, could she? I tried to shake off the thought, but it clung to me. I told myself it was coincidence, that I was just on edge. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about how she always managed to reach out right when I was at my most vulnerable. The next few days were hell. Every time I looked at Lana's texts, I felt a knot in my stomach. I found myself analyzing each message, each word, wondering if there was a hidden meaning. She continued sending her little notes and gifts, trying to lift my spirits, but instead, it only made me more suspicious. Why was she so invested in my life, in my project? And why did I know so little about hers? Finally, one evening, I decided to dig a little deeper. We were out to dinner, and I tried to bring up her work in a subtle way. "So, how's consulting going?" I asked, doing my best to sound casual. "You always keep it pretty mysterious." She shrugged, giving me her usual nonchalant smile. "Oh, it's just consulting. Boring stuff compared to what you're doing. I'm jealous, honestly. You get to actually make things happen." She leaned closer, putting a hand on mine. I wanted to believe her, but something about her answer rang hollow, like she was playing a part. Then, out of nowhere, she added, "But don't worry, I'd never let anyone steal you away from that amazing company of yours." It was a throwaway comment, just a joke, but it hit a nerve. Her words echoed in my mind long after I got home that night. Steal you away from that amazing company. I couldn't shake the thought. That was the kind of thing someone would say if they already knew what was happening. But I tried to push it out of my head. I didn't want to believe that the person who'd been my confidant, my support, was somehow involved in hurting my career. It just didn't add up. But the more I dwelled on it, the more I realized that there was a lot about Lana that didn't add up. I'd gotten so swept up in her charm, her support, that I'd never questioned why she kept her life so private. She knew almost everything about me, my work, my routines, my stress points. And yet, what did I know about her, really? I couldn't take it anymore. That night, I went through every message, every note she'd left. Each one seemed harmless on its own, just the small tokens of someone who cared. But together, they started to paint a picture. She'd been there through every stage of the project, subtly nudging me, supporting me, getting me to open up about things that should have been kept confidential. That was when it clicked. Lana hadn't just been listening to me. She'd been studying me. After that night, there was no going back. I couldn't shake the realization that Lana wasn't the woman I thought she was. She wasn't just curious or overly supportive. She'd been deliberately worming her way into my life, making me trust her and feeding off the information I let slip. And now, knowing she was working for the competition, it felt like a punch in the gut. At first, I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to confront her, just to see if she'd deny it or confess. But I quickly realized that was exactly what she'd want. Lana was too smart to let something like this slip through her fingers without having some sort of backup plan. She'd probably laugh in my face, tell me I was imagining things, and flip the whole situation on me. I could almost picture her smug smile, the way she'd look at me with that cool, collected gaze, as if I was some kind of fool for even thinking I could call her out. No, confrontation wouldn't work. If I was going to get Lana back, I'd need to be just as subtle, just as sneaky as she'd been. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't going to confront her. I was going to make her believe that I hadn't figured her out, that I was still under her spell. Meanwhile, I'd work behind the scenes to expose her. But to pull this off, I'd need some help. I thought about hiring someone who could dig up everything on her. Maybe a private investigator. It sounded a little extreme, but I knew I couldn't risk going to anyone in the company. That would tip her off too easily. If she caught even the slightest hint that I was onto her, she'd disappear or, worse, somehow make me look like the guilty one. That was when I remembered a friend from college, a guy named Paul, who'd gone into private investigation. I hadn't talked to him in years, but after a quick call and a few updates on old times, I explained my situation. He was skeptical at first, but as I gave him the details, every suspicious interaction, every slip-up in her story, he started to understand my urgency. I could almost hear his interest peak when I told him about the leaked documents, about how everything pointed back to my project and my access. "All right, Mark," Paul said, his voice serious. "If what you're saying is true, then she's dangerous. And if she's as careful as you say, we'll need a way to get her to expose herself." I agreed, feeling a cold determination settle over me. "Just find out everything you can about her," I told him. "Where she works, who she answers to. I want to know every connection she has." The next few days were a strange game of cat and mouse. Lana continued her usual routine, texting me sweet messages, leaving little notes, acting like the supportive confidant. And I played along, texting her back, pretending to be as clueless as ever. The hardest part was keeping my anger in check, not letting her see that every smile, every innocent question made my blood boil. I told myself it was worth it, that soon I'd have the upper hand, and she'd regret ever thinking she could manipulate me. A week into the investigation, Paul called me back. His findings were even worse than I'd expected. Lana was more than just an employee for a competing company. She was deeply embedded in their network, someone they called upon whenever they needed sensitive information. Apparently, this wasn't her first rodeo. She'd done this before, playing the interested lover card to get access to high-level projects in other firms. And here I thought I was special. "She's a pro," Paul said. "Her company probably doesn't even keep her on the official payroll. She's like a ghost. No paper trail, no clear affiliations. It's all through private channels. She gets in, gets close to someone with access, pulls the information, and then vanishes." The reality hit me hard. I'd been her mark, just a target to her. All those late-night conversations, the laughs, the so-called support, none of it was real. She was playing a role, and I'd been falling for it hook, line, and sinker. "Mark, if you want to nail her, you'll need something solid," Paul continued. "Something she can't deny. We need her to expose herself, preferably on record." An idea began to form. If I could set a trap, create a situation where she thought I was still oblivious and willing to share confidential information, she might slip up. I started drafting a few fake project documents, doctored with bits of information that looked real but were ultimately useless. My plan was to let her find them, to dangle bait she couldn't resist. If she took it, we'd have her red-handed. But to do this, I'd need to act even more invested, like I was still wrapped around her finger. It was sickening, pretending to care, feigning excitement when she texted me, and worse, pretending to trust her. Every time I responded, every time I smiled at her little messages, it felt like a lie. But I pushed through, determined to keep up the act until she made her move. The last time we met in person, I felt like I was walking on thin ice. I put on my best clueless smile, laughed at her jokes, and pretended to vent about new changes to the project. I even hinted that we'd be merging data from another department, something she'd shown interest in before. She lit up, her eyes practically gleaming as she pressed me for more details. I kept it vague, giving her just enough to keep her hungry, to make her feel like she was still in control. But inside, I was counting down the moments until her game would finally collapse around her. I'd been playing my part, carefully setting her up to fall into the trap. I'd even started to feel a sense of control, like maybe I was finally one step ahead of her. But, as it turns out, I was still just a pawn in Lana's game. It was the night before I planned to confront her. Paul and I had set everything up. He'd be nearby, waiting for her to take the bait and leak the fake project files. We'd agreed that once she'd accessed the fake documents, we'd have enough to expose her without giving away any actual company data. She'd take the fall, and I'd finally be free of her and the mess she'd dragged me into. But that's not how it went. That evening, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't pick up, but something told me to answer. The voice on the other end was cold, professional, and somehow familiar. "Mark, you don't know me, but I know all about you. I represent a group that's very unhappy with recent events, and we thought you should know what you're walking into." My heart pounded. "Who is this?" "You're being played, Mark. Whatever you think you know about Lana, you're missing the big picture. She's not just working for your competitor. She's been working for herself, manipulating both sides from the start." I felt like the ground had dropped out from under me. "What are you talking about?" The voice sighed, a hint of frustration slipping through the professional tone. "Lana has been leaking information to both your company and your competitor. She's been selling secrets back and forth, creating a bidding war to drive up her own payout. Your fake documents won't trap her. In fact, she's already planned for it. Once you hand over those files, she'll leak them herself, making it look like you're the traitor." I could barely breathe. But why? How would that help her? Money, of course. She's going to cut ties with both companies and cash in her final checks. The final stage of her plan is to burn both of you, walk away, and leave everyone else picking up the pieces. The reality hit me like a ton of bricks. All this time, I'd been thinking I was in control, that I'd somehow caught her in the act. But the truth was, I'd only been following her script. The trap I'd set for her was nothing more than a setup for myself. As the call ended, I felt numb. Lana had outplayed me at every turn, crafting a scenario where I was both the fall guy and the fool. I thought I'd been getting even with her, but really, she'd been manipulating me right to the end. The next morning, I confronted her, not with anger, but with a hollow calmness that came from knowing I had nothing left to lose. When I told her everything I'd learned, she didn't even flinch. She just smiled, that same, cold smile I'd seen when we first met. "Oh, Mark," she said, almost pitying. "Did you really think you were the only one with a plan?" I had to admit it. Lana was a mastermind. Standing there in my office, her gaze steady, she didn't show an ounce of regret or fear. It was like she'd prepared for this exact confrontation, knowing exactly how I'd react, how I'd unravel at the seams. She wasn't some corporate pawn, and she wasn't just an agent for my competitor. She'd been playing both sides, manipulating every step and reaping rewards along the way. "So what now, Lana?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. I'd thought I'd feel rage, maybe even desperation, but instead, I just felt empty. She gave a slight shrug, as if this was just another business deal. "Well, I'd say it's time to move on, wouldn't you? We've both had our fun, but it's clear we've reached an end." She glanced at her watch. "And frankly, I'm due for a vacation. Is that all this is to you?" I asked. "Just some game?" She let out a soft laugh, the kind that was almost pitying. "Mark, you're smart. But don't kid yourself into thinking there's something more here. We both got something out of this, didn't we?" I couldn't argue with her there, but it didn't make any of this feel any better. It just made me realize how completely I'd been used. I tried to think of what I could do to salvage this, to get out of this mess with my dignity intact. And that's when I thought of my ace in the hole, the one piece of information Lana didn't have. "All right, maybe you're right," I said, slowly. "Maybe I was naive to think there was more to this. But I still have some leverage." She raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Oh, and what would that be?" I took a deep breath, deciding to lay my last card on the table. "You may have outsmarted me here, but I know enough about you to make a mess of things if I wanted to. You've got no clean record, no real way to cover your tracks if this goes public. I know people, Lana. I could make sure you lose everything, maybe even more than I would. You wouldn't be able to slip away from this one." Her smile faltered for the first time. Just a flicker of something, a crack in her confident facade. "You're bluffing." "Try me," I replied. I'd played along with her game long enough, and I could see now that I wasn't powerless. I may have been a fool for trusting her, but I still had options. "Here's how this is going to work. You're going to take that vacation you were talking about. You're going to walk away, and I'm going to make sure you don't get another cent out of either company. If I see you back here, if I hear so much as a whisper about your schemes, I'll make sure everything about you comes out." She narrowed her eyes, her gaze turning cold. For a moment, I wondered if she'd try to call my bluff, or if she'd somehow find a way to twist this, to turn my words against me. But then, something shifted in her expression. It was almost like she'd finally seen me as a worthy opponent, someone who wasn't going to roll over and let her have her way. "All right, Mark," she said slowly, her voice low and calm. "You want me gone? Fine. I'll disappear. But don't think for a second you've won. You're just another player in the game." I wanted to feel victorious, to feel like I'd finally gotten the upper hand. But there was something in her tone, something that made me doubt myself. Was she really agreeing to my terms? Or was this just another part of her strategy? I knew I had to watch my back from now on, but for the first time, I felt like I'd managed to turn the tables, if only a little. She left my office with the same calm confidence she'd shown the first time I met her. I watched her go, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. Part of me wondered if this was really over, if she'd actually disappear as she'd promised, or if I'd just given her the opening she needed to strike again. But at least for now, I'd made it clear that I wasn't going to let her walk all over me. I didn't hear from her for days. My project went back on track. My coworkers stopped looking at me like I was some kind of traitor, and the suspicion around the leaks slowly faded. But I kept my guard up. I knew that someone like Lana didn't just vanish without a trace. She'd be out there, somewhere, waiting for the right time to make her move. But I was ready. She taught me a lot, even if it was the hard way. She taught me that trust is a dangerous thing, something to be guarded carefully. And she taught me that in the world of corporate power plays, you can't rely on anyone but yourself. In a way, I almost respected her. She'd been ruthless, but she'd shown me just how far some people would go to get what they wanted. And now, as I stood on the other side of it, I knew I'd never let anyone play me like that again. Months passed, and just like that, Lana was gone. She'd vanished as if she'd never existed. No messages, no emails, no signs of her trying to get in touch. For a while, I kept expecting her to show up again, to try one last trick. But it never happened. It seemed like I'd finally put the whole thing behind me. My life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be. I poured myself into my work, pulling late nights to make up for the damage she'd caused, re-earning the trust of my team and my bosses. But something had shifted in me. I couldn't let my guard down, couldn't shake the sense that I was still missing something. Lana was too smart, too calculating to just walk away without leaving a trace. I felt like she'd left a puzzle, a final piece that I'd missed. That piece showed up in the form of a single letter, mailed to my home address, with no return name or address. I didn't recognize the handwriting, but as soon as I saw the handwriting, a chill ran through me. It was Lana's. Her elegant, sharp cursive was unmistakable. I opened the envelope, half dreading, half expecting what I'd find. Inside was a single note, short and cryptic. "Mark, don't think you know the whole story. Sometimes the most dangerous game isn't business, but survival. I'll be in touch when you're ready to know the truth." I stared at the words, reading and rereading them, trying to make sense of what she meant. The truth? I'd thought I'd known it all, that she was a manipulator, a player who'd only seen me as a pawn. But this letter felt different. It was almost personal. What kind of truth could she mean? Weeks later, I couldn't get the note out of my head. I had Paul, my investigator friend, run a check on Lana. He dug deeper this time, pulling up records that weren't public, piecing together connections I hadn't even thought of. And then, one day, he called me with something I didn't expect. "Mark, it's strange," he said. his voice wary. Lana's not just some corporate spy. I found records indicating that she's been involved in multiple disappearances. They're unofficial and nothing's been proven, but her name comes up in connection with several people who went missing under suspicious circumstances. People who were later linked to high-stakes business schemes. What are you saying? I asked, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. Some of those people were found later, dead. And here's the thing. In every case, it looked like someone was covering tracks, making sure nothing led back to her. But I can't prove anything. As Paul continued talking, a horrifying picture began to form. Lana hadn't just been gathering information for money or leverage. She'd been eliminating people who stood in her way. My mind raced, thinking back to our last conversation, to the coldness in her eyes as she'd walked away, warning me not to think I'd won. A chill ran through me as I realized the truth. I'd only seen the tip of the iceberg. Lana was more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. She wasn't just a corporate agent. She was someone willing to go to any lengths to get what she wanted. And somehow, I'd been lucky enough to escape with my life. I started to see that our entire relationship, from start to finish, had been her way of testing me. She'd manipulated me, pushed me to the edge, and let me think I'd won. But in the end, I hadn't even been her primary target. I was just a piece in a much larger, darker game, one she'd mastered long before she'd ever met me. Now, as I held her letter in my hand, I knew one thing for sure. Lana wasn't finished. She'd left that note as a reminder that she was out there, somewhere, watching, waiting, and maybe one day, when I least expected it, she'd be back to finish what she started. For now, I had my life back, but the price of knowing Lana had left me with a haunting awareness that the game never truly ends.